"You must be joking, Grandpa." The words rolled across the rifle range like a challenge, drawing laughter from a dozen young Marines standing beneath the bright Carolina sun. The crackle of radios, the distant hum of generators, and the rustle of range flags in the afternoon breeze all seemed to pause for a moment as every eye turned toward the old man. Samuel Walker stood quietly near the equipment rack, his weathered hands resting at his sides. At 82 years old, he looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. His faded field jacket hung loosely on his shoulders. The denim on his jeans had softened from years of wear. A pair of scuffed boots carried the dust of countless miles. Nothing about him suggested he belonged on one of the Marine Corps' most respected training ranges. Corporal Ethan Briggs smirked as he stepped forward. At 23, he was everything Samuel was not. Tall, confident, sharp-jawed, and proud of every stripe he had earned. Around him, several Marines exchanged amused glances, already enjoying the spectacle. "You looking for the visitor center?" Briggs asked. More laughter followed. Samuel's expression never changed. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the firing line stretching across nearly 1,000 yards of open ground. Heat shimmered above the red Carolina clay. Beyond the targets, pine trees swayed gently beneath a cloudless sky. It was a beautiful day for shooting. "No," Samuel said calmly. "I was wondering if I could borrow a rifle." The laughter became louder. One Marine nearly doubled over. Another shook his head and muttered something that made the others grin. Briggs folded his arms. "A rifle," he repeated. "You planning on joining the Corps today?" Samuel simply nodded toward the range. "Just wanted to take a look." The response only encouraged them. Briggs glanced around at his friends. "Hear that? Grandpa wants to take a look." The group erupted again. Samuel waited. He had spent enough years around young men to recognize the difference between disrespect and immaturity. Most of them weren't bad Marines. They were simply young. Young enough to think confidence and experience were the same thing. A gust of wind swept across the range, fluttering the flags mounted near the firing lanes. Samuel watched them carefully. Not the nearest flag, the farthest one. Then he looked at the wavering heat above the dirt. A faint smile almost appeared before disappearing again. Briggs noticed. "Something funny?" Samuel shook his head. "No, just checking the wind." That answer triggered another wave of laughter. "The wind," Briggs said. "We've got ballistic computers for that." Several Marines proudly tapped the electronic devices attached to their gear. Samuel nodded politely. "I'm sure you do." His tone carried no sarcasm. Somehow that irritated Briggs even more. Confidence he understood. Arrogance he expected. But Samuel's calm indifference felt different. It was as though the old man wasn't impressed by any of it. Not the uniforms. Not the technology. Not the attitude. Briggs stepped closer. "Look, sir, this isn't some public gun club. These Marines train here every day." Samuel met his gaze. "I know. Then you know we don't hand rifles out to strangers." "That's fair." The answer caught Briggs off guard. No argument. No complaint. Just agreement. For a brief second, neither man spoke. The breeze continued to sweep across the range. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled above the tree line. Then one of the younger Marines pointed towards Samuel's jacket. "Hey, what's that?" Several heads turned. Sewn onto the left shoulder was an old patch, faded nearly white from age. The stitching was worn. Parts of the design were barely visible anymore. It looked ancient, forgotten, like something rescued from a box in an attic. Briggs glanced at it and laughed. "Well, there's your qualification." The Marines chuckled again. "What is that thing?" someone asked. Samuel looked down briefly at the patch. His hand brushed against the weathered fabric for the briefest moment. The smile vanished completely. His eyes seemed to drift somewhere far beyond the rifle range. Somewhere much older. Somewhere none of the young Marines could possibly see. Then he looked back up and said quietly, "Just an old patch." The laughter gradually faded, but the smirks remained. Samuel Walker stood motionless beside the equipment rack while the Marines returned to their conversations, each of them convinced the entertainment was over. Corporal Ethan Briggs was not ready to let it go. There was something about the old man that bothered him. It was not the request for a rifle. It was not the worn jacket or the faded patch. It was the calm, the complete absence of embarrassment. Most civilians would have walked away by now. Most would have become defensive or angry. Samuel had done neither. He simply stood there as if he had all the time in the world. Briggs glanced toward the firing lanes where several Marines were preparing for the afternoon qualification drills. Targets sat between 600 and 1,000 yards downrange. Spotting scopes shimmered beneath the heat. Expensive optics rested atop precision rifles worth more than some used cars. Everything about the range reflected modern military professionalism. Everything except the old man standing quietly beside it. Briggs shook his head. "Tell me something, Mr. Walker. Have you even fired a rifle in the last 20 years? Several Marines nearby paused to listen. Samuel looked toward the distant tree line. "Not recently." Briggs grinned. "That is what I thought." A few chuckles followed. Samuel offered no explanation. He did not mention the countless mornings he had spent watching wind patterns while drinking coffee on his porch. He did not mention the habit of studying clouds, leaves, and shifting shadows. Some skills changed with age. Others simply waited. Briggs took a step closer. "You know these Marines train every week, right? They spend years mastering this." "I am sure they do," Samuel replied. The answer somehow felt like an insult, even though it clearly was not. Briggs crossed his arms. "And yet you just walk up here asking for a rifle." Samuel nodded. "That is correct." The younger Marines exchanged amused glances. One of them whispered something about retirement homes. Another joked that the old man probably thought the range was part of a historical exhibit. More laughter followed. Samuel heard every word. None of it seemed to reach him. His attention drifted once again toward the range flags. The nearest one fluttered lightly from left to right. The farthest flag moved differently. A subtle shift. Almost invisible. Samuel noticed it immediately. Briggs noticed Samuel noticing it. "Still checking the wind?" he asked sarcastically. "Yes." "You really think you can learn something from a piece of cloth?" Samuel looked at him. "Sometimes." Briggs laughed again and turned toward the group. "Hear that? We should throw away a few $1 million of equipment and replace it with flags." The Marines erupted once more. Standing several yards away, Lance Corporal Noah Hayes watched quietly. Unlike the others, he was not laughing. His attention remained fixed on the old patch stitched to Samuel's shoulder. There was something familiar about it. Something buried deep in memory. He could not place it. Not yet. The more he stared, the stranger it seemed. The patch looked old enough to belong in a museum. Yet Samuel wore it with the casual ease of someone wearing a wedding ring. Not for display. Not for attention. Simply because it belonged there. Noah felt an uneasy sensation settle in his stomach. He had seen arrogance before. He had seen veterans exaggerate stories before. But this felt different. Very different. And as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the range, he found himself wondering whether Corporal Briggs had just made a mistake none of them understood yet. Noah Hayes could not shake the feeling. While the laughter continued around him, his eyes remained fixed on the faded patch resting on Samuel Walker's shoulder. The symbol was worn nearly beyond recognition, but fragments of it still survived. A dark shape, a narrow border, a design that looked older than anything currently used by the Marine Corps. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory stirred. He had seen something similar before. Not on a uniform, not on a wall. In a photograph. Briggs clapped his hands loudly, drawing attention back to himself. "All right," he announced. "Since everyone is having such a great time, maybe we should see what Grandpa can actually do." Several Marines immediately grinned. Others stepped closer. The atmosphere shifted from amusement to anticipation. Samuel remained silent. Briggs walked toward a rack containing training rifles. Sunlight glinted across metal and glass as he studied the selection. His eyes settled on one rifle in particular. It was one of the most demanding precision platforms on the range. Accurate, heavy, unforgiving. A rifle that required discipline, patience, and experience to use effectively. Briggs lifted it and carried it back. "How about this one?" he asked. Samuel glanced at the rifle and nodded politely. "That will work." The answer surprised Briggs. Most civilians would have looked intimidated. Samuel sounded as though he had been offered a cup of coffee. Briggs handed the rifle over. Several Marines watched carefully, expecting hesitation. There was none. Samuel accepted the rifle with steady hands. Not fast, not slow, simply comfortable, like greeting an old friend. No one noticed it immediately. So did a few others. The old man never inspected the rifle, never admired it, never acted impressed. He merely held it naturally. That bothered Briggs more than he wanted to admit. "Target is 900 yards, Briggs said. You think you can still see that far? Laughter followed. Samuel looked downrange. The distant steel target appeared tiny against the bright landscape. Heat waves danced above the earth. Wind drifted across the open ground in subtle currents. I can see it, Samuel replied. Briggs smirked. Good, because half the Marines here spent all morning working that lane. Samuel nodded. Looks challenging. Again, no arrogance. No boasting. Just quiet observation. The response somehow made the younger Marines feel less certain. Noah stepped slightly closer. He watched Samuel study the range. The old man's eyes moved from flag to flag, then to the grass, then to the tree line beyond the target area. It was as though he was reading something invisible. Briggs noticed as well. Looking for directions? He joked. Samuel shook his head. Just paying attention. The answer hung in the air. For a brief moment, nobody laughed. Then Briggs rolled his eyes and motioned toward the firing position. Well, let us see where paying attention gets you. Samuel started forward. The afternoon breeze swept across the range once more. His old jacket shifted slightly as he walked. The movement exposed more of the patch. Noah caught another glimpse of it, and suddenly remembered where he had seen the symbol before. Not in a photograph. In an old display case inside the base history building. His heartbeat quickened. He stared at the patch again, uncertainty turning into curiosity. Around him, the Marines remained focused on the coming shot. Nobody noticed Noah quietly pulling out his phone. Nobody noticed him zooming in on the patch. And nobody realized that within the next few minutes, a simple photograph was about to begin a chain of events none of them could have imagined. Corporal Briggs stepped back and motioned toward the firing line, still smirking but with a hint of uncertainty creeping into his posture. Samuel Walker adjusted the rifle in his hands, the metal cool beneath his fingers, the woodstock familiar and comfortable as if it had been waiting for him all these years. The younger Marines whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others leaning in closer to watch. Lance Corporal Noah Hayes remained quiet, his eyes scanning the patch, and then back to Samuel, a growing sense of recognition tightening his chest. Samuel moved to the firing position with steady, deliberate steps, each footfall soft against the red clay. The sun beat down on the range, heat shimmering over the distant targets, nearly 1,000 yards away. Flags rustled in the light breeze, a signal that caught Samuel's attention as he crouched slightly, aligning himself with the target. He raised the rifle with practiced ease, his eyes narrowing, focusing not on the distance, but on the subtle movement of air and light across the range. Briggs leaned forward, whispering to a fellow Marine, "I bet he misses entirely." A ripple of laughter followed, subdued compared to before, the anticipation beginning to outweigh their amusement. Samuel did not glance at them, did not flinch at the murmurs. His gaze remained fixed, calculating. No one noticed the slight tilt of Samuel's head, the way his thumb rested gently on the bolt, the meticulous way his eye traced the path from sight to target. There was no hurry, no showmanship, only focus. Samuel exhaled slowly, the air dry and warm in his lungs, and the faint scent of pine and dust mixing with the smell of spent brass from earlier drills. Briggs tightened his grip on his own rifle, the smirk fading as the reality of Samuel's calm precision began to register. The range felt quieter somehow, the hum of distant machinery and the chatter of the other Marines dimming, as if Samuel's presence absorbed the noise. Noah's hand trembled slightly as he held his phone, zooming in on the patch, the design now unmistakable in his memory, a symbol of valor long remembered but rarely seen. Samuel adjusted his stance, subtle movements aligning him perfectly with the target. The sun cast a sharp shadow across the ground, highlighting the faded patch on his jacket, the symbol flickering in the light. Every Marine on the line felt the tension, the previous laughter replaced by a silent acknowledgement that something was happening beyond their understanding. Samuel's finger rested lightly on the trigger, his mind attuned to wind, distance, and angle, drawing on instincts honed over decades. He glanced briefly at Briggs, not with challenge but with quiet assurance, and then returned to the target. The air around them seemed to hold its breath, carrying the faint rustle of flags and the soft shift of the breeze, all aligning with the moment. Every second stretched longer than normal as the Marines watched, the distance between them and the old man shrinking not physically, but in the weight of presence and command he radiated. Samuel steadied his grip, eyes locked, breathing measured. Noah stepped closer, still silent, fully aware that the simple act of holding the rifle, the position of the patch, and the focus in Samuel's eyes were telling a story older and far greater than any of them had realized. The line between observer and participant blurred, and for a single suspended moment, the range belonged entirely to Samuel Walker and the memory stitched into that old, faded patch. The air on the range seemed to thicken as Samuel Walker settled into position, his eyes still tracing the subtle movements of the distant target through the shimmering heat. The rifle rested firmly against his shoulder, every joint and muscle responding with practiced ease, almost instinctively, as though decades of experience had been folded into the very fibers of his being. The young Marines leaned forward slightly, trying to see the old man's face, searching for signs of hesitation, uncertainty, or doubt. They found none. Briggs frowned, his earlier confidence wavering, while the whispers among the group quieted, replaced by a sense of tense curiosity. Noah Hayes remained still, fully aware that something was unfolding that none of the others yet understood, his eyes flicking from the patch to the rifle, back to Samuel's focused gaze. Samuel adjusted his stance with a subtle movement, aligning the rifle with the target, his mind reading the wind as if it were a silent language. Dust swirled around the base of the targets, faint motes catching the sunlight. Samuel breathed steadily, each exhale measured, blending with the distant hum of the generators and the rustle of the flags in the warm afternoon breeze. He did not speak. He did not acknowledge the murmurs or the shifting weight of the Marines behind him. Only the faint brushing of his jacket over the patch seemed to register, as if it carried a memory, a story hidden in thread and faded colors. Noah observed the old man's hands, the careful way they rested on the rifle, the subtle pressure of thumbs and fingers that indicated control and familiarity. Samuel's eyes flicked to the farthest target, almost invisible beyond the heat haze. There was no hesitation. There was only recognition of distance, of trajectory, of time. A faint smile barely touched his lips, but it did not linger. The young Marines felt an inexplicable unease, a shifting of the energy around them, a quiet tension that replaced their previous amusement. Briggs opened his mouth to comment, to inject another sarcastic remark, but the words faltered on his tongue as he noticed Samuel's complete calm, a calm that implied absolute competence, unquestionable certainty. The rifles in their hands suddenly felt heavier, their own experience and training seeming insufficient, inadequate. Samuel shifted slightly, fine-tuning his position, reading the flags, the heat rising from the red clay, the distant hum and the gentle wind as part of a calculation that only he could see. Noah's hand rested lightly on his phone, zooming in on the patch again, the symbol now unmistakable, stirring an old memory, a recognition that seemed to bridge decades. Every element aligned. The range, the targets, the rifles, the heat, the patch, and Samuel himself became a single moment of attention and anticipation. Each Marine felt it, though none could explain why. The sun beat down on them, casting long shadows that stretched toward the target, and in the stillness between breaths and whispers, it became clear that this was more than a simple drill. Samuel Walker, with an unassuming stance in a weathered patch, held the quiet weight of history in his posture, the kind of presence that could make a room, a group, or a training range pause and reconsider everything they thought they knew. The moment hung, delicate and charged, the space between preparation and action suspended, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the presence of a man who had lived through decades that the young Marines could only imagine. As Samuel Walker held the rifle steady, a sudden shift occurred in the atmosphere on the range. The laughter and whispers had tapered off, replaced by a quiet tension that seemed to ripple outward from the old man like the concentric circles on a pond. Lance Corporal Noah Hayes could no longer look away from the patch, now fully convinced that he had seen it before in an old archive photograph inside the base history building. His pulse quickened, a mixture of curiosity and anticipation filling the empty space left by the fading laughter. Samuel's eyes scanned the far targets, tracking subtle changes in light and shadow, gauging distance and wind, each movement deliberate and precise. He adjusted his stance slightly, aligning the rifle, and the sun glinted off the polished metal of the barrel. Every muscle was relaxed yet engaged, the weight of the rifle perfectly balanced in his hands, demonstrating experience that had been honed over decades. Briggs shifted uncomfortably, realizing that this was no ordinary drill and that Samuel's calm demeanor concealed a depth of skill none of them had anticipated. The young Marines watched closely, their previous amusement replaced with a mixture of fascination and unease. Samuel's finger hovered near the trigger, his mind attuned to every environmental factor, the heat rising from the clay, the faint rustle of pine needles in the distance, the subtle drift of the flags along the line. Noah snapped a quick photograph of the patch, the symbol now crystal clear, and sent it to his superior, the master sergeant, initiating the first link in a chain that would quickly escalate up the chain of command. Samuel's movements remained methodical, precise, almost ritualistic, the rifle an extension of his body. The targets seemed smaller with each passing second, but Samuel's gaze never wavered. Every other Marine felt the weight of his presence. Time seemed to stretch, and the air thickened with expectation. Samuel lowered his shoulders slightly, repositioning his feet, as if communicating silently with an audience only he could see. The distant line of targets appeared sharper, more defined, through the heat haze, and he breathed in, steady and measured, exhaling with the same calm control. The young Marines were transfixed, some leaning forward involuntarily, others shifting their weight, recognizing without understanding that this was a demonstration of mastery beyond their years. Briggs glanced at Noah, who only nodded subtly, acknowledging that the patch carried significance they could not yet comprehend. Samuel's gaze briefly met Briggs's, a look of quiet assurance and unspoken knowledge that commanded respect without a word. The wind carried the faint scent of pine, dust, and spent brass, mingling with the warmth of the afternoon sun. Samuel adjusted the rifle one last time, the old patch on his shoulder catching the light and drawing attention once more. The symbol, worn and faded, seemed to glow in that moment, carrying with it decades of history, honor, and experience. Every Marine on the line felt the moment stretch further, a silent anticipation building like a coiled spring, as Samuel prepared to take action. The subtle shift of the breeze, the gentle sway of the flags, and the quiet focus of the old veteran together created a tension that was almost tangible, signaling that something remarkable was about to happen, and that the ordinary assumptions of the day were about to be challenged in a way none of them could yet imagine. Noah Hayes felt a chill run down his spine as the photograph of the patch reached the master sergeant, who immediately recognized the symbol without hesitation. Within minutes, a chain of communication had been initiated, master sergeant to lieutenant colonel to colonel, colonel to the general's office. Samuel Walker, completely unaware of the growing attention, continued to check his footing and the alignment of the rifle, his focus absolute. The distant targets shimmered under the afternoon sun, their outlines distorted by the heat waves, but Samuel's eyes seemed to pierce through them effortlessly. The young Marines shifted nervously, sensing the sudden weight of expectation, though they could not yet understand why. Briggs folded his arms and swallowed, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Noah, still crouched slightly behind the line, watched the pulse of the radio network light up with messages flowing from one command post to another, each one verifying the identity suggested by the patch. Samuel's hands moved with calm precision, adjusting the rifle slightly, testing the feel of the wind, calculating distance without looking at the rangefinder. He exhaled slowly, a breath that carried decades of experience and discipline, the kind that only comes from years of observation and practice. The sun glinted off the polished metal of the rifle barrel, the heat rising in shimmering waves across the clay and dust. The tension was palpable, the young Marines feeling it in the muscles of their shoulders, in the shallow breaths they did not even realize they were holding. A distant vehicle rumbled past on the service road, but its sound was muted in the presence of something far greater. Samuel's eyes moved over the target, his mind calculating angles, distances, and wind shifts, invisible to those around him. Noah's phone buzzed with a reply from the colonel, confirming that General Kane was now aware and moving to the range. The word spread quickly through the command chain. Though the old man remained unaware, his attention fixed entirely on the task at hand. Briggs glanced at Noah and saw the urgency in his expression, realizing for the first time that the day's events had taken a turn he could not control. Samuel shifted his stance, adjusting the rifle and his position, feet planted firmly on the red clay. The patch on his shoulder caught the light once more, the faint colors and worn stitching telling a story of valor and history, a story that only the attentive could read. The breeze stirred the flags along the range, each movement a subtle signal, unnoticed by most but seen and interpreted by Samuel with instinctive clarity. Every Marine in the immediate vicinity felt the change in energy, the air charged with anticipation, though they could not explain why. Samuel's focus was total, yet calm, each micro-adjustment revealing mastery earned over a lifetime. The photograph on Noah's phone, the confirmation from the chain of command, and the careful, deliberate movements of the old man converged into a single moment that seemed suspended outside of time. The distant targets waited. The sun cast long shadows across the range, and in the silence between whispers and shuffling boots, the realization settled in. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and all the Marines present were witnesses to a presence and history far larger than themselves. The low rumble of a vehicle echoed from the far service road, signaling a presence Samuel had not yet acknowledged. The distant hum became sharper, the silhouette of a black SUV emerging as it approached the edge of the range. Noah Hayes froze, recognizing the telltale formation and speed of an official vehicle. The doors opened, and General Robert Kane stepped out, his polished uniform reflecting the sun, his posture rigid yet commanding, every movement measured and deliberate. The general's eyes immediately found Samuel, a subtle narrowing that indicated recognition, and a ripple of attention spread across the Marines like electricity. Briggs stepped back instinctively, a cold realization settling in that they were witnessing the arrival of someone of undeniable authority and history. Samuel adjusted his grip on the rifle, still unaware of the general's approach, his focus entirely on the distant targets, the wind, and the subtle shifting of the flags. Noah's fingers tightened around his phone as he glanced toward the general, sending a subtle signal to the others, though no words were spoken. The black SUV doors closed behind the general as he moved toward the line, each step deliberate, carrying a presence that commanded silence without a single utterance. The Marines instinctively straightened, boots crunching on the gravel as they shifted to stand at attention, their previous smirks and laughter replaced by a tense respect they had not felt before. Briggs swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between Samuel and General Kane, understanding now that the man holding the rifle was no ordinary veteran. The sun cast long shadows across the range, the heat shimmering on the red clay, and every small movement, the sway of Samuel's jacket, the glint of the rifle, the rustle of the flags, was magnified in the intense, quiet anticipation. General Kane stopped a few yards from Samuel, standing directly behind him, his gaze steady and unwavering. He raised a hand in a measured salute, the kind that carried authority, recognition, and respect in equal measure. The sound was subtle but filled the space, a single gesture that rendered all previous amusement meaningless. The Marines felt it immediately, an unspoken acknowledgement that the moment had shifted, that they were now in the presence of history made manifest. Samuel's eyes lifted slightly, catching the movement, and he allowed a subtle nod in return, a silent communication of understanding and recognition. Noah exhaled softly, the tension releasing just enough to allow comprehension. The distant targets remained, yet their importance had shifted from challenge to ritual. Every Marine understood, without words, that Samuel Walker and General Kane shared a history written in deeds, respect, and unspoken honor. The range, the heat, the flags, the rifles, all became part of a tableau where the ordinary assumptions of the day had been overturned. Silence reigned, thick and tangible, as the general's presence confirmed the significance of the patch and the experience it represented. Samuel's calm demeanor remained, his focus absolute, yet the world around him had changed, every Marine aware that they were witnessing something remarkable, a rare convergence of legacy, authority, and quiet mastery. The distant hum of the afternoon seemed to fade, replaced by the weight of recognition, the kind that demanded respect and left no room for doubt. A pause in time that would linger in memory long after the sun began to set across the range. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The entire range stood frozen beneath the afternoon sun as General Robert Kane lowered his salute and looked directly at Samuel Walker. The old veteran nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement between two men who needed no introductions. Then the general turned toward the assembled Marines. His eyes settled briefly on Corporal Briggs before sweeping across the line. No anger, no raised voice. Somehow that made the silence even heavier. "Carry on," General Kane said calmly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of authority that only comes from a lifetime of service. Samuel adjusted his grip on the rifle once more and returned his attention to the distant target. The moment of recognition had passed. The task remained. A warm breeze drifted across the range. The flags shifted gently. Heat waves rolled above the clay. Samuel watched it all. The target sat nearly 900 yards away, a small shape dancing inside the mirage. Around him, dozens of Marines stood perfectly still. Nobody laughed now. Nobody whispered. Even the sounds of equipment and conversation from neighboring lanes seemed distant. Samuel inhaled slowly. The years seemed to fall away from him, not physically, but mentally. Experience took over. Observation, patience, understanding. Things no machine could fully replace. His fingers settled against the trigger. One controlled movement followed. A moment later, the distant steel target responded. The sound arrived seconds afterward, a faint metallic ring drifting back across the range. Nobody reacted at first. The Marines simply stared. Several glanced toward the spotting scopes. Others looked toward the target itself. Briggs blinked twice as though his eyes had deceived him. They had not. Samuel remained motionless, still studying the conditions. Then he carefully handed the rifle back. No celebration, no smile, no dramatic speech. Just a simple return of borrowed equipment. The quiet somehow made the moment even more powerful. General Kane stepped forward. "That is enough," he said softly. Samuel nodded. "I thought so." A few Marines exchanged confused looks. The general smiled faintly. He always hated showing off. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the group before fading again. Briggs finally found his voice. "Sir, who is he?" General Kane looked toward Samuel for a moment before answering. "A man who spent his life earning respect instead of demanding it." The answer lingered in the warm air. Noah Hayes glanced once more at the faded patch. It no longer looked old. It looked important. The symbol had not changed. Their understanding of it had. Samuel slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and started walking toward the parking area. The Marines instinctively stepped aside, creating a path without being told. Some nodded respectfully. Others simply watched. Briggs stood silent as Samuel passed. The old veteran paused briefly. "You have a good group here," he said. Briggs swallowed. "Thank you, sir." Samuel smiled faintly and continued walking. No lecture. No humiliation. No attempt to settle scores. Just dignity. General Kane watched him go until the old veteran reached the edge of the lot. Then the general turned back toward the Marines. "Remember this day," he said. "Technology changes. Equipment changes. Uniforms change. Character does not." Nobody forgot those words. Years later, many of the Marines would remember the heat, the flags, the silence, and the old patch that changed everything. But most of all, they remembered the lesson hidden inside that quiet afternoon. Respect is not something you can see on a sleeve, measure on a range, or calculate on a screen. Sometimes it arrives wearing faded cloth and carrying decades of wisdom. And the wisest people rarely feel the need to tell you who they are.